you let, are we live? We are, okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ned Mumtaz. I'm your host for today's webinar. The topic is Global Transparency Reporting Dynamics 2.0. We will dive into the topic and into some of the core discussion areas momentarily. I do want to run through a few housekeeping items before we dive into the webinar and introduce our set of guests for the panel discussion. You may have seen some of these faces in the posts that were put together for this session. If you have had an opportunity to register, you are live. And those of you who are joining, just signing up momentarily, we will share more details about the webinar in just a second. Again, the topic is Global Transparency Reporting Dynamics 2.0. An important disclaimer. And in fact, let me just read it so that I don't change any of the keywords. So this information that we will be sharing with you is general information only. It does not constitute legal or business advice and should not be used as a substitute for seeking legal counsel, business advice, or regulatory guidance. Outcomes, best practice guidance, regulatory requirements may differ based on your specific facts. We may discuss some examples, we may share some of our experiences, but those are very specific to the situations that the presenters, panelists would discuss, and they don't represent general guidance in any manner. All information that will be shared during this webinar or opinions that are expressed are in individual capacity only, and they do not necessarily represent the views of their respective organizations. And also very importantly, these are not recommendations, suggestions, or such. These are simply sharing of discussion points and experiences that the panel members have. Quick guidance on housekeeping. This is for all the participants. Your microphones are muted. If you run into any technical difficulty, there are several members of the technical team who are active to support this webinar, and they'll be happy to assist. The best way to do it would be to type in the issue in the chat window, and our technical team will help. In case you can't type in for any reason in the chat window, you have the phone number on the screen. Please dial that in and someone will then help you. Secondly, very important, we strongly encourage you to actively participate through engagement and Q&A. What we will do is we will take your questions throughout the session, and we'll try to address them during the session itself and not defer them to the end. There are several topic areas that we will cover that I'll again share with you momentarily. We will try to direct those questions to the given topic area, but in any event, we will do our very best to entertain your questions as much as possible. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be reviewed post the webinar. It will be revised or refined for any glitches or errors or omissions. And then after that, it will be posted on our website for you to download if you so choose. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the panel members today. I'm going to go through this list from left to right. So one of our panel members is Melissa Frayne. She is the Director of Global Transparency Reporting at AstraZeneca. I have had an opportunity to discuss some of the areas that Melissa manages in her global transparency responsibility. I feel she is definitely a thought leader in and how she's managing the global transparency function. She manages a large team. She manages a very broad scope. And I feel that there's a lot of information that you can glean from her experience, her approach, and I'll dive into it a little bit more a little later. Shortly, I'll give Melissa an opportunity to share a bit more about her experience and background. Also joining us for the panel is Dr. Klaus Gelfetzer. Klaus has a lot of experience in life sciences. He has worked for Centon as a chief compliance officer. Currently, Klaus provides advisory and consultant services in the life sciences pharmaceutical space. Klaus also have prior experience with Allergan, and the one key experience that I recently just shared and learned is that Klaus is a avid sports person. He plays men's field hockey, a passion that I share, and we were just discussing how maybe a decade back, when I was playing field hockey, Germany was one of the leaders in the space, and I checked that out over the last few years. Germany has won around 20 medals between Olympics and World Championship in field hockey, around half a dozen gold. So Klaus, welcome to the panel discussion. And then we have also Mark Ucini joining us as a panel member. Mark also has tremendous experience in pharmaceutical life sciences, in compliance, and broader in marketing, as well as in speaker bureau management. Mark worked for Janssen Pharmaceuticals. He also has experience in the industry around 20 years, and he's been managing and directing Vector Health for last 10 years. I'll briefly share my background. So I've also spent around 20 years in the industry. I worked for Pfizer, Schering-Plough, Eisai, and Otsuka Pharmaceuticals in various capacities, operations, compliance, and such. And then for the last 3 years, I've been part of Vector Health. So panel members, welcome to the session. I feel that the attendees will really benefit from your broad and deep experience. With that, I would like to give each of you a couple of minutes to share a bit more about your background and experience. So in the same order, Melissa, if I could kindly ask you to share a bit more about your background.
Melissa. Sure. Thank you, Ned. And thanks for the kind words. So I really started my career actually in public accounting as an auditor and a CPA, but I found myself in life sciences compliance back in 2009, I suppose, helping support a company go through a CIA, and with that had certain transparency obligations. But really at that time, we didn't really have the U.S. Sunshine Act yet. And so I decided to take a change in my career path and leave accounting and transition over into the life sciences sector. So I went to a medical device company, a smaller orthopedic company, and they also were going through a CIA and had required transparency obligations. But I really started as the ag spend manager to support the implementation of all the processes to support the data collection and reporting of open payments, as well as the state laws. And sat in compliance for about 4 years doing transparency, as well as other responsibilities, including like auditing and monitoring, policies and training. And then I decided to move into big pharma. So I came over to AstraZeneca a little over 7 years ago, moved to the DC area, and I do global transparency all day, every day, 365. So I live it and I breathe it, and I absolutely love it. I have a great team. But I most notably support 30 countries across Europe, including those that have obligations under the FPA code, as well as local laws, and then a couple of markets in the Middle East.
Phenomenal. That's a tremendous experience, and I'm sure we will enjoy some of the dialogues and discussions around global transparency momentarily. Thank you, Melissa. Klaus, if I could kindly ask you to share a bit more about your experience and background in the industry.
Yeah, I started in the pharmaceutical industry in the last millennium. So I'm a kid from the 1990s still in industry. As you already mentioned, the first company was Allergan, and I was in the regulatory group for 6, 7 years, 8 years, and then joined Santen, ophthalmic company, as well as Allergan was in the past, in 1998. Is that right? Yeah. So the first few years in Santen, I was still in regulatory affairs, but later on moved into a marketing position for 7 years, and then compliance popped up as a new subject, and a company looked for somebody who would cover that topic and came back to me and asked me whether I would lead the European group on the compliance side. And yeah, the last 4 years I've been involved in transparency reporting like every other company, both, like Melissa said, for countries where there's a legal requirement and others where there is industry code. And last year I started an early retirement program with Santen, so I'm still a Santen employee, but officially garden leave, if you like, and hope to continue as a consultant for a few more years now.
Excellent. Thank you, Klaus, and welcome. And I also want to give Mark an opportunity to share a bit more about his background and experience. Mark?
Thank you, Ned, and hello to everyone out there. Hope you're having a wonderful day. I won't add too much more to what Ned said, but yeah, as he did mention, I've been here at Vector Health the last 10 years or so, with a focus on our compliance practice, auditing, analytics, transparency, and like many of you out there, I think I had no appreciation back when I started, when we were just focusing on the states, that things would evolve as much as they have to, federal reporting and global reporting and all the different nuances that there are there. So it's been quite an interesting ride.
Excellent, great. Thank you, Mark. So without further ado, let's dive into it. I'm sure you want me to be out of your way and hear directly from the panel members on the topic. So let me quickly do that. What I would like to do is just set the topic a bit and spend a minute or two describing what's been labeled as Transparency Reporting 2.0. So effectively, any organization today that's responsible for producing the transparency report at any jurisdiction needs to perform, I would take these minimum steps that are listed on the left. Collect their spend, organize it, verify it, quality assure it, and then report it in the format and the place that the obligation requires. If it's US Sunshine report, it goes to CMS. State reports go to the relative states. Each has its own very clearly specified format. Around Europe, if it's a regulatory requirement, then the format that's required, the content that's required is assembled and delivered. FPIA brings a little bit of consistency across multiple jurisdictions. And again, it has its certain format that one needs to follow. Right, so those are 4 pretty standard steps that every organization at the minimum needs to perform. Now, if you've been doing this work around transparency in US, you probably by now have a good 10 years of experience and more, starting with state reports. Moving to the international space, France, I think, was one of the early adopters of transparency, and then the FPA directive. You certainly still have a good 5+ years of experience. So given that, the one question that compliance leaders and their leadership colleagues wonder and ask is, what steps can compliance take to potentially do 3 things? Number one, improve the accuracy of the report, which is also saying to reduce the risk that's in the report. Secondly, to provide better insights, better understanding around the transfer of value, the TOV behavior, TOV activities throughout the year, not just as the final report is published. And the third important thing is to build a better alignment, create greater engagement with the stakeholders, both internally and externally. The benefit of internal stakeholder engagement is that you get a lot of colleagues to help verify the report, or at least to understand it and then support the attestation process. Externally, you are creating a closer engagement with the external members, HCPs, so that they appreciate the obligation that you have as the industry representative, as a company representative. And secondly, that stronger engagement and alignment helps you in ensuring several aspects of that report. In US, that's around dispute management and ensuring that there are fewer disputes that you are tracking and managing. In EU, the engagement is deeper. You need to gain consent in order to provide the details. Post-consent, you need to ensure that the information is accurate. And with GDPR, there are several other obligations. So in all aspects, stronger internal engagement of the stakeholders and external engagement of the stakeholders makes your compliance responsibilities that much better. So those are the 3 subject areas we will dive into. Those have been summarized into these various areas that I'll maybe list, and then we'll dive into it. So I've listed around 11 of these overall. We would look to cover them at some level of depth and discussion. The whole idea is that you gain an appreciation of what these are. You hear from industry colleagues who are living it, who are actively engaged in these various capabilities, assembling them, maintaining them, benefiting from them, and also facing the challenges to recognize that these are very real capabilities that organizations can adopt to improve their transparency reporting. Hence the little bit of poetic license in claiming it to be transparency reporting 2.0, sort of implying that that is more comprehensive than just the basic reporting. With that, I would like for the panel members to maybe express their general opinion on the notion of this transparency reporting 2.0 that I briefly described. So with that, maybe I'll call in the panel members for their comments and any feedback. Maybe I'll go in the same order. And Melissa, if I could kindly ask you to comment on this notion, please.
Where do you want to start, Ned? Do you want to start on stakeholder engagement?
So Melissa, just overall on moving the dial from basic transparency reporting to creating additional capabilities overall, and then we will cover each of these topic areas in depth momentarily.
Okay. Yeah, so just high level, I think, understanding what your resources are, if you have a centralized team, if you have a decentralized model, knowing who your partners are within the different countries, because I do think that is detrimental to the success of a transparency program. regardless of where transparency sits, Ned had mentioned compliance. I can tell you that we do not sit in compliance, but we do have communication directly with them in terms of like anything that we find through our monitoring process. So wherever it sits, if it's a central center of excellence, or if it's in finance or compliance, understanding what those resource capacities are. But I can tell you that, I think one of the bigger things we consider is we obviously have all these obligations, but we want to be as efficient and lean as possible. And so to the extent, you have the ability to have automation, either through like Python or through dashboards and advanced analytics, that's fantastic. But everything, of course, is scalable. So if you're a smaller manufacturer, with a smaller budget, some of those same things can be done, through good old tools like Excel. I think another challenge is getting trust and buy-in when you want to do those transparency reporting requirements, and maybe some of the countries that have historically done their own. For example, France was one of the first markets that had the Sunshine Act. Their obligations extend outside of transfers of value to the contractual arrangements, and that's something that, we currently at AZ, we are in partnership with them, but they are still doing some of those things that we don't have the visibility into, such as the contractual arrangements. But we do have a homegrown solution, and we do have a pre-disclosure portal. We do have dashboards, we do have Python code, but before all that existed, we were doing things, with business objects and extracts to Excel and pivot tables and graphs, and looking at ways to really monitor the data, and also having an independent quality assurance program. So not only do we have team members who are dedicated to specific countries that are data mining throughout the year, we also have kind of an independent, I would call it internal audit, but it's not internal audit. It's kind of a self-inflicted quality assurance check, if you will. And that person reports directly into me, and she is looking at everything globally. So even though I may only be limited to disclosures in Europe and Middle East, she is truly doing a global QA/QC and has that separate set of eyes, and she's not involved in the data collection or the reporting itself. So I think those are just kind of some of the high level thoughts.
Phenomenal. Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate it. Klaus, if I could kindly ask you to comment on this general notion of moving transparency from 1.0 to 2.0.
When I look at transparency 1.0, as you called it, for me, this was a nuisance when it was dropped on our desk as a new topic 5-6 years ago by FPA and also by the French government. Considering it, transparency is valuable, of course, and I'm proactively voting for transparency. However, the way it was set up, at least in Europe, is probably not a real transparency. You already mentioned the consent management that is part of it. And when you look at the reports, you see that 20 or 30% of HCPs don't give consent. So you never have a complete set of data that is published. You only have 2/3 maybe with names, and the other 1/3 or more is in aggregate data and cannot be called transparent as such. So from that perspective, there has always been for me additional work which was not really needed. Of course, when you look at the US and you look at France and some other countries now where you have a legal requirement, there you are approaching total transparency, but you're probably not getting there yet, but you're approaching it. So having said that, I think it's important to get some additional value of this extra work that we have. And the additional value for me is the closer interaction with your stakeholders in the company, as well as external stakeholders, as well as HCPs directly, setting up new processes around the transparency reporting, and thereby allowing for better flow and better processes within the company. And also working with the limited resources that in particular the small companies like my company had. Just to give you an example, when we look at Samsung and, for example, AstraZeneca, we probably have just 1/10 of the number of employees worldwide as a company like AstraZeneca. So our representation in the country is relatively small. In some countries, we have just 2 or 3 people. And when you now go to them and say, well, in addition to what you do for your marketing and sales, please look at transparency and please provide me with good data that I can publish accordingly. So there is a limitation, and that means you have to look at a good process, and you need to make sure that things are set up, but also that the whole process provides additional value to the company and not just the reports that are published on the website.
Excellent. Phenomenal points. I'll come back to those because again, for the purpose of our participants, I do want to call out that it is important for us to compare and contrast the needs, the challenges, and the benefits both small, mid-size, and large manufacturers could attain from these capabilities. And we will touch on those aspects as well. But Klaus, thank you. You bring up a very important point to ensure that there is an appreciation of the volume, size, and capacities in discussing some of these capabilities and data points. Mark, anything else that you would like to cover and add that we may not have touched so far?
Just maybe a brief reflection on sort of where the state of the industry is here in terms of 1.0 to 2.0. I think beginning in 2010 or so, and for the first half decade, I'd say after that, most all companies were really in transparency reporting 1.0, just focused on accurate transactional level reporting. I think large companies, some of the larger companies were able to migrate more quickly to this 2.0, where this slide represents a more thoughtful process, being able to scale up to the many more reporting jurisdictions accurately, as well as to really understand the information and before reporting and utilizing it for other parts of the organization. Many large companies were able to sort of move to this, but I think some of the small to medium-sized companies, due to resourcing, both people and budgeting, have not made it here yet. And I think now that's kind of the focus, is try to do this in an efficient way. Again, both from a budget and resource perspective, but I think there are many tools out there now to help people get there.
Excellent, great, thank you. So what I want to do is budget the time so that in the next 30 minutes we can cover at least these 10 topics. So I'll dive right into them. And again, I want to encourage all the listeners to send in your questions. We'll do our very best to address them. The idea is that there is as much of an opportunity to interact and learn and listen from the panel members and their experience. And the best way to do that is to ask them questions and have them address those. That said, let's quickly dive into it. And I'll go in the order that the sequence is listed here. So the first thing is around Legal Digest. And the idea is for the team to stay up to speed with all the regulatory changes that are coming in. To Klaus's point, if you have a small 2-3 person team in a certain jurisdiction, and there are additional obligations coming in for reporting or changes taking place, you want as much of lead time to address that. To Melissa's point, in all fairness, some of these capabilities are actually harder in a larger organization because you have a much larger volume of activity. And with that larger volume of activity, depending on the nature of the change, you might have a much larger rock to redirect and replace or move than what a smaller organization might be able to do. So that said, again, the benefit of having visibility into upcoming potential regulatory changes or directives is to preempt and prepare your team and address it. So that's the first topic area. What I want to share and show is that there are several places today the compliance organizations can go and begin to learn about these. Several teams that collect these share. There are several webinars. There are several sessions that help, conferences that help give you that insight. But the obligation still is with the organization and the leadership to make this listening post active and engaged so that they are able to get early knowledge of any changes or any activities that are coming up. Here is a quick sort of layout of recent changes that have happened in the last year or two. We have a team that follows it. I certainly am not on top of them, so I turn to them for guidance and help. And there are other sources in the industry, and even a very simple summary of the types of things that are happening, even just the dates. There are so often that my colleagues turn to our support team and just want to know when the various dates are coming up, and they change and the requirements change often. So what I would like to do is maybe ask both Melissa and Klaus to share how you try to stay current on some of these types of changes that are coming in or that are happening in the industry. Anyone, whoever wants to go first, please.
Ladies
I-
first. Melissa.
I can speak. So I think this is where that stakeholder identification, actually, I would almost put that in parallel with this regulatory monitoring, because you really need those stakeholders. And of course, yes, we have tons of wonderful vendors out there, you know, Vector Health. I know that like we participate on the King and Spalding calls, but there's a lot of vendors that have great solutions that help to do that monitoring, but there's still accountability within the organization. And we work very closely with, you know, stakeholders within each country, whether that's a legal person or a finance person or a compliance person. There's at least one person within every country that I partner with who kind of helps keep us on top of things. And so it's through that kind of frequent communication that we are able to monitor. So, you know, I'm not surprised, like when I'm on the King and Spalding call and I hear, you know, that Italy's bill, they're now probably moving that on to the next phase. And I've been watching this bill for 2 years, right, with my market champion. Do you have any updates yet? Do you have any updates yet? So I really think it takes the combination of both to stay on top of these things.
Phenomenal, excellent. Klaus?
Yeah, fully agree to Melissa. It's important to have the contact to your country people, to your stakeholders in the various countries. The problem in my case was that it was only the country manager I could speak to with such topics, because there was no regulatory person on site, there was no compliance person on site. The countries have different focus, what they're interested in. They're certainly not interested much in transparency, but more in having a good business in the country. So more or less, I relied on the data, on the information provided by vendors, by service providers. And I wouldn't name any of them, but there are service providers out there that provide solutions for transparency reporting on the one hand side, but on the other hand, also provide some regulatory digest or regulatory intelligence on the changing requirements. That, for example, was where I noticed that in Belgium, the law was coming up, and it allowed me to contact then the country manager from my side and tell them, oh, hang on, there's something coming in your country. Are you prepared? So it was the other way around in that case. And the same for Italy. I heard about it from our vendors before my country manager in Italy told me that legal changes are coming up.
Great, excellent. Klaus, just a quick alert. There's a little bit of freezing happening with the video on your end. So if someone is tapping into your Wi-Fi capacity, see if you can look into it.
Let me just check the connection, but
All right.
I stay on, of course.
Okay, super, thank you. So moving to the next topic area, again, in terms of the, let me just make sure I'm sharing it, sorry. Okay, that's better. So moving to the next topic area was HCP engagement, right? Getting engaged with the HCPs as early as possible. And there's a whole sort of level of sophistication an organization can assemble. But the idea is that as a recipient of the final result of that HCP's engagement, whether that's in consultative capacity, honoraria, etc., the team on the transparency side has visibility into it. If the compliance is formally establishing contract management and monitoring of HCPs, then the transparency team would want to be one of the stakeholders in establishing that process so that you can, if nothing else, cross-check that if there were 10 consultants engaged and you're only seeing spend come through for 5, what's happening with the other 5? So that's just the most simplest aspect, but HCP engagement has taken an important central role in helping to track and manage that relationship. If you would like to add any additional aspects to it, I would love to hear, but in the interest of completeness for 2.0, I wanted to bring that up. Any thoughts, Mark, Melissa, or Klaus, around HCP engagement or best practices?
Yeah, if I can start this time, I think the benefit of a smaller company is that you get involved in many activities, not all of them, but quite a few. And in my company, we organize it in a way that everything that was cross-border was sent to the European compliance group for pre-approval and checks. So we had a good oversight of what's going on cross-border wise and also big events in the larger countries. Of course, there's still something left in other smaller countries that cannot be or was not oversight by compliance at my time. But at least you have a good picture of what's going on and you have an early engagement with your marketing group and the respective functions that get involved in setting up these. We also had direct contacts with agencies that organized events for the company. So it was, compliance was always involved in team meetings and project meetings with external agencies that helped setting up events. So that was really a benefit for working in a small company.
Phenomenal. All right, excellent. So moving right along, the next topic that Melissa had very nicely identified in terms of capabilities was around QA, monitoring, and use of IT capabilities, programming capabilities, and other tool sets to keep the team on top of the spend space, knowing what's going on across multiple jurisdictions. So the topic area is to enable or have the capability so that at the minimum, as a compliance leader, you have good visibility around TOVs and spend activity that's happening throughout the year, and not just when the final report is about to be assembled. So that's a significant difference between Transparency 1.0 versus Transparency 2.0 is the capacity and the ability to know all the spend activity throughout the year and be able to oversee it across multiple jurisdictions centrally, consistently, versus at a point maybe once or twice a year. How does that help with quality assurance, with monitoring? I think that's an important topic area, and I would love to hear the panel members around their perspective on it. Maybe Mark, if I could tap you first on this topic around use of analytics for oversight, quality assurance, and monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good example of, one of the best examples of moving from 1.0 to 2.0 in terms of being able to scale up, if you will, from in the past a jurisdiction or two to the many jurisdictions we have that we need to report to. And I think it's really the best way to fully understand one's data before reporting, so that one can be much more proactive in avoiding those compliance issues that come up as we look at the data. And it's something that many of the sort of smaller and mid-sized companies that I speak to, a couple times a week, are still trying to get their arms around in terms of how to best do this. So some of the panelists here who've gone through that process can maybe speak to those early steps that they took in putting those things in place. That might be helpful.
Thank you, Mark. Melissa, you talked about Python, IT, monitoring, quality assurance, and analytics and dashboards. Love to hear your perspective on the benefit from sort of intelligent analytics that your team has utilized.
So I absolutely love this topic. This is probably my sweet spot of the whole presentation. So, I mean, I think there's so many benefits, whether it's for your own QA/QC purpose or if it's for your internal stakeholders, like those market champions within those countries that are supporting you, to give them that level of visibility, a higher level of visibility, to even, more broadly, those customers within the organization outside of transparency disclosure, and where there are benefits to maybe clinical or R&D. So there's so many benefits to this data. And I know we've been talking at conferences for 10 years about big data, but I haven't really heard too much of like what people are doing in terms to accomplish that. But I think I'll just kind of share our story. So 6 years ago, I started supporting 25 countries under FPIA. And I went out to those individuals within markets to ask them, what would be important to you to see? How would you like to see your data summarized? What kind of key points would you want to see? Is it like your top 20 HCPs? Yes, consent, no consent. Your top 20 HCOs, R&D, spend by cost category, spend year over year, and so forth, right? Like what kind of analytics would be meaningful? And so based on that, the good old fashioned way, taking the data from your repository or data hub, exporting it to Excel, mainly creating about 20 graphs to accomplish these visuals, and then copying and pasting those graphs, into PowerPoint in a way that is aesthetically consistent, for these 25 countries. So as you can imagine, that it was very laborious and took, probably took me a good 4 days to do this. And, but since then we have come a long way, and we have had the, opportunity to leverage Python script to do what took me 4 days to do can now be done in about 30 minutes. So that frees up my capacity to look at the data more from a storytelling perspective. And that's what I always encourage my team to do. It's, I think we get so lost in the details of collecting the data and making sure that our systems are configured correctly, but we need to be able to tell the story. What does the data mean? And the nice thing is that when you have like these dashboards, you can quickly identify, well, R&D increased, 20% from last year to this year. Is there a business rationale for that? Did we increase the number of local studies there? Or maybe there's an anomaly within the data, like maybe the wrong GL is being used. It's classifying maybe royalties as R&D when royalties are out of scope for, FPIA, and those really should have been, out of scope. So it helps you identify anomalies at a high level that you might not find if you're combing through the details. And then being able to present this information in a way that's as automated as possible. So we really went from doing things very manually in Excel and PowerPoint to having a Python code to then creating actual visual dashboards through an interface, like on top of our reporting tool, and then giving different business owners specific, viewing privileges, if you will. So for example, my market champion in Austria, she can go in and look at her dashboard for Austria anytime throughout the year. She can see what her total spend is, what her total HCP consent is, her spend year over year. So we've given that tool to our customers as well as us having that ability. And then I think when you really move even beyond that, it's who within the organization, who else might benefit from this? Is it compliance? Is it internal audit? Are there different sectors of, different, functional areas, at the leadership level who would be interested in seeing this data, that it could provide meaningful metrics. So I just think it's kind of been a long journey for us, but we're in a really good place now. But it can also be accomplished, with, if you have a smaller budget, you could, take the Excel and write some macros. So it doesn't have to be super fancy, but you do need to think about how the information should be presented in a way that you can identify some of those anomalies and how you can tell the story to your customers. I think that's really going to help, especially like when we get to sub-attestation, is to have something where we can show that story. I'll tell you, like my UK customer, they basically expect like a P&L flux analysis. They want to know, why did everything change from last year to this year? And I have to really spend a good couple of days digging into that, but I start with those dashboards.
Phenomenal. I would say this, Melissa, because I loved when you said that that's one of the sort of cornerstones in moving to 2.0. I've had an opportunity to speak with maybe 150 different manufacturers around their needs in compliance, transparency, and especially in their ability to track and manage the spend throughout the year. And what I find is that there are two very discernible groups. One that has not made the journey to move their information into any type of analytics. And as you said, it could be as simple as Excel-based macros, though that's a lot of work. And I'm impressed that you were able to finish 25 countries in 4 days. I find it hard to believe, but I'll accept it. So that said, what if you got a phone call and there was one correction that had to be made 25 times, or one new metric that someone needed times 25? So that's the challenge around the Excel. But still, to your point and to the point being discussed, once you make the transition to having visibility both at your level and your stakeholders level, then it is very difficult for you to go back and look how the function was operated. I have seen where we have gone and helped organizations bring online their historical data. And as we do so, they sit puzzled, they sit very nervous, because they know the level of insight and the level of information analytics begin to offer. And they know that they weren't doing that level of inspection or QA or monitoring in the past. And they're very worried what this onboarding of data into an analytics capability might show. And it always shows something sometimes fairly drastic. We see a couple of months with zero spend activity. Now, all that was sort of lost in the overall totals that were getting assembled. And there was no really easy metric to tell them that, you know what, you had zero payments for food and beverage in the month of May. That's not practical, right? And this is pre-COVID, right? It's just simply that for the month of May, whatever system they were collecting their spend from did not supply it, or they didn't check it, etc. We also see the month of June soon doubled. So that possibly means that somehow the transactions for previous month got double added to that month. Sometimes when we change the dial to individual HCP level, a key opinion leader, an important consultant who's been receiving honoraria and consulting fee year over year, let's say $30,000 to $40,000, and there's certainly a gap in a given year. And then we look for tails such as travel, food and beverage, other spend. If those exist, then simply somehow the consulting fee payments for that given year were missed. So this starts to show just in the historical data, but once the team becomes accustomed to it and your stakeholders become eyes and ears for you as well, because now they are monitoring their own precincts, their own regions activity, then I agree with you. This is the biggest sort of difference in progressing from basic reporting to some level of sophistication and advancement in it. I see you nodding, so I'm hoping you're agreeing with that. And I don't know if some of your locales saw some of those differences. Klaus, any thoughts that you have around this topic?
I think this topic is actually what I meant at the beginning with having additional value from collecting and generating the data. This is where you can really educate even your organization, for example, about the spend for certain types of activities, about the differences between country A and country B on engaging HCPs, etc. So you have a much clearer picture of what's going on in the business. And when you present it for the first time to senior management, you sometimes see eyes of surprise when they actually realize what spend happened over the last 6 months or last year or so. I think it's really important to have a good tool here to allow these analytics. For small companies, it's always a bit of a hurdle to have a good application for processing the data. But as Melissa said, it can work on Excel. I tried it in the very first years and tried to pull out some data, but myself as a regulatory person, I grew up with word processing and not with Excel. So I'm not capable of running any macros, I would still recommend to have a good application that provides you dashboards, provides you some built-in tools in the application that you can run these analytics.
Phenomenal, excellent. And taking on the cue to what Klaus just said, Melissa, I'm going to come back to you with a question around stakeholder engagement and pre-attestation. I know in our discussion earlier last week, you had shared the very comprehensive process that you have assembled, which gives you a better risk management, better stakeholder engagement, and more eyes looking at that information so that your final report is that much more accurate. I would love for the other participants to also hear some of the processes and steps that you have put in place at AstraZeneca to ensure accuracy and quality of your reporting information. So Melissa, if you won't mind sharing some of that pre-attestation process.
Sure. So I think it's bigger than just the sub-attestation. It's, I mentioned earlier, we have like this year-round project timeline. So we're not waiting until April, May, June to really QA/QC the data. We have a very regimented timeline. There are interdependencies throughout the year. So, we're looking at our different data sources, some of which have very nice interfaces, but we still do data quality checks and reconciliations between those data sources and our data hub, our repository, like SAP being one of the largest for our direct payments. And we're doing that like on a semi-annual basis, right? And then separately, we're also looking at all the other data, whether it be from cross-border or from manual data sources, such as like our global third-party vendors. We're looking at that data as well, semi-annually. So once we've done the financial analysis review, if you will, from like SAP or whatever your accounting system is, then looking at all your manual data and the data holistically, we're preparing what we call a data packet. And that data packet basically includes your full data set at a transaction level per market. That goes then to those market specific, customers, whether those are country specific or regional specific. However, if you have clusters, as long as you have someone within those designated areas, those champions, if you will, we show them their transactional data. We provide a draft of their disclosure report, and we provide them those dashboards that I mentioned. We have a slide deck version as well as, the interface that I mentioned. So we really give them those three components, but we do our own level of review, and we have a very consistent process by which we identify anomalies. We then present them, with consistent verbiage, because again, we're thinking about language barriers. We want to keep the language as simple as possible in how we document the anomalies and our findings. And then we give them the opportunity to give us feedback and input. So once they've given us their input, we then determine what the corrective actions are. Some of those may fall on my team's responsibility, and some of those may fall on the market. So whether there are vendor master updates or your customer master updates or corrections to be made, or maybe data that did not come in through the interface that needs to be manually uploaded, we're doing that on a semi-annual basis. So we've done all this throughout the year to get our market stakeholders very confident in the data, so that when we then go to, get the sub attestation, 1 month prior to disclosure, they already know what their data looks like. And kind of backstepping here, we also offer pre-disclosure as an option. Not all of our countries want to do it because it's not required under FBA code. Some markets feel like it's not worth it to them. Some completely depend on it for various reasons, but we tailor that solution, or we make it an offering. If they want to do it, great. If they don't, that's fine. And if they do, we can tailor how they want to use it or to what extent. So they've had all of these chances to look at the data throughout the year. And then basically, we have a sub-attestation process that we facilitate through DocuSign. It's really a simple Word document. You update the year every year, and who your country president. For us, we require sub-attestation by country by the CP and the CFO. Once we have that, then the final attestation is our FPA board member, and that goes on our global sustainability site. But we're really relying on that market champion to be our cheerleader, if you will. And in terms of what we're presenting to like that president or CFO, it's not the transactional detail. They don't want to see the weeds. They don't want to see how the sausage was made, as I like to call it. They just need to see those high level metrics, those analytics, that dashboard. And as long as you can provide the story and get them comfortable with that high level analytics, then we really have, it's been pretty seamless in terms of being able to get their attestation.
Phenomenal. You've mentioned pre-disclosure. Maybe if you can touch on it for a few more seconds on the process you follow for pre-disclosure in those regions where pre-disclosure is offered by you.
Sure. So, we do have some countries that just say, no, we're not going to do it. I would say probably a third of my European markets don't use it, but the other 2/3 who do use it in different ways. We did build ours in-house. I have what's called the internal site. It's really meant for like the administrators like us, so like the transparency team, as well as those market champions, where we can go look at the spend details by recipient. There's also an external site, which is kind of managed with support from other teams outside of transparency, where HCPs can actually log into the portal and see their data. There's also a consent feature. We have a radial button for making consent yes or no. But again, this pre-disclosure portal is completely customizable per country. So it is a very cost prohibitive type thing depending on your budget. And the way that it's used, I mean, it's like having, an apartment building. Yes, it's one building, but every apartment could have a different floor plan. So each of our countries, some countries, for example, like Germany is one of those markets that has very strict data privacy regulations, where they have to actually present all of their data, the spend, to their HCPs in order to obtain consent. Whereas a good majority of countries that are using consent as a basis, they're getting consent at time of contract. And so it really depends on the country. The majority are going to do it at time of contract. And then you have those countries that also have migrated towards legitimate interest as a basis without the need for consent, but who still may wish to give HCPs the ability to opt out of individual disclosure. So we have really customized it. You know, we can turn the consent feature off and on. For the majority of Europe, HCOs are considered legal entities without the need for consent. So you simply wouldn't see that section, you know, and then we have some countries that might have self-incorporated HCPs who are established as HCOs, and there's only a couple of those, but where they still have to update consent manually for those. So it's really, I think, whatever you want it to be, but it is great because it allows us to document any disputes or inquiries, and we can either log them on behalf of our market, the market can log them on behalf of the HCP, or the HCP can log in, you know, for themselves. So we've really given ourselves that kind of flexibility.
Phenomenal, outstanding. Thank you, Melissa. I think we've just come up on the hour. So first I want to really thank each one of you for an excellent discussion, a lot of insight. Of course, we just scratched the surface on this notion of consent management dynamic 2.0 or consent reporting and transparency reporting dynamic 2.0. We have another session planned a couple of days from today. In addition to that, for anyone who's on the webinar and they have any questions, we welcome you to send those in and we will share them. Again, I want to thank each one of you and want to give you maybe another 30 seconds or so for any thoughts before we close the webinar. Open floor, any comments or feedback. If not, again, much appreciated. Thank you everyone for listening and attending. And panel members, thank you so much.
Thanks for being part of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Excellent.